Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. If I could get your attention, please. I know we're having a lot of fun, but we have the man of the hour here now with us. Give me just a couple of moments, if you don't mind. Today, does anybody know what special day it is today?
New Year.
Chinese New Year. It is the year of the rabbit. So there's your totally useless trivia for today. I don't know if you're like me, but I woke up this morning around 4:30. My cell phone was ringing. I reached over and turned the light on the nightstand, and I looked, and it was one of those numbers that I don't recognize. If you're a parent, you know that feeling. The good news was it was Alabama Power telling me that the electricity had been restored to my area. I then scrolled down through the news alerts I received, and I see that the men and women we send to Congress can't play in the same sandbox, so we continue a debt ceiling impasse. I see where the state of Alabama is blaming EPA for the Moody landfill fire. Sadly, another mass killing in Monterey, California. And as I looked at those things, I began to reflect. And then I picked up something off the top of my desk that I had shared with a few people. And I want to share it with you today because I think it's appropriate to what the Jewish faith in particular teaches us. If you only carry one thing throughout your entire life, let it be hope. Let it be hope that better things are always ahead. Let it be hope that you can get through even the toughest of times. Let it be hope that you are stronger than any challenge that comes your way. Let it be hope that you are exactly where you are meant to be right now, and that you are on the path to where you are meant to be. Because during these times, hope will be the very thing that carries you through. Whether we're Jewish or of the Christian faith, our hope is in our God. Lester, I turn it over to you. Good morning. Thank you. Here's your pointer, and you have been instructed to speak into the microphone.
Yes, sir. I'll do it. Good morning, everybody. I can't believe you're back. No, it's good. It's so good to have you here. I know of one story that speaks to hope, a Jewish story, forgive me, but, while we're on the subject. I love this joke. It's a story about a man in older days who goes to see his brother who lives in another city. So he's on his horse, and it's a journey, and he finally arrives at the little town in Eastern Europe, and the town has a big gate. And he's shocked to see his brother sitting outside the gate. He says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm at work." He said, "What do you mean you're at work? You're sitting here in front of the gate." He says, "They hired me to wait for the Messiah." He said, "That is the dumbest thing I ever heard. What kind of job is that?" He says, "I know, but it's steady." All right, so we are in Exodus. Don't everybody get up at once. We are in the second book of the Torah. I mentioned that the Hebrew name for the books of the Bible are manifestly less interesting than the names that were given later in translations. But it's known as the book of Shemot. And Shemot is a plural. It means names, because that's how it starts. These are the names of those who went forth da 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 da, and it traces, I believe, some genealogy. But anyway, it basically recaps the numbers of those who went from the tribes of Jacob, now Israel, into Egypt, who the host that came down per the deal that Joseph made with the Pharaoh of that time, that Israel could come and settle in the land. And this lasted quite a while. And we're not far into the book, but that we get to one of the momentous sentences in that book. And there arose a new Pharaoh in Egypt who knew not Joseph. The historical theory for this has to do with a coup d'etat, where there was a different line of pharaohs at the time that Joseph went into Egypt. They were, in fact, a usurping line of pharaohs known as the Hyksos. And these pharaohs were much more kindly disposed toward outsiders. And so, I don't want to get too loaded here, but let's just say their immigration policies were much more liberal. And this Pharaoh is not of that line. This Pharaoh is a nationalist Pharaoh from another line who knew not Joseph. Now, these Hebrews had been in Egypt for quite a while, and his fear began to manifest itself that what if they grow to the point where they are even bigger than they are, and our enemies come along and get them to join with them against us. Them against us is always a recipe for disaster, by the way, in a nation. Them against us. But that's what he says. And they join us up, and we must get them up out of the land. So he does this by inflicting harsh laws, restrictive laws, and eventually forms of involuntary servitude, building civic work projects, pyramids, tombs, places like Pitom and Ramses and all of this. And so you know the story. Eventually, a law is promulgated that the firstborn of all of the Hebrews shall be put to death, and all the midwives are instructed to do this. You just kill the baby if it's the firstborn and it's a male. If it's a female, you can let it live. And Moses is such a baby, and his mother puts him in a basket and floats him down the river where it floats to the palace of Pharaoh. And you know the story from there. Moses is rescued out of the basket by Pharaoh's daughter, and he is brought up in the palace of Pharaoh and all of that. Well, anyhow, that is the beginning of the story. And this is where Moses comes into our picture. And Moses dominates 4/5 of the Torah. Beginning in this chapter, as an infant, he becomes one of the main focuses of the rest of the Torah. This is why it is the 5 books of Moses, primarily. So we have that. The experience of slavery, and equally important, the redemption from slavery by God through Moses' leadership, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, all of that is commemorated every year by command in the Torah. It is, in fact, our holiday of Passover. And, you know, Passover's like Easter, you know how it moves around. We say it moves around. It doesn't move around. In the Hebrew calendar, it never moves around. But the Hebrew calendar has leap months to compensate, like we have a leap day in the solar calendar every 4 years, you know, but the lunar calendar reckons it differently. And so sometimes Easter is late, sometimes early, but it's actually always on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which is not a car. Anyway, there it is. what I called in the first class, Exodus is the beginning of the gestational period of the Hebrew people. The conception was maybe Jacob and his descendants, the tribes, and this is the rather long gestation. A lot of mistakes are made, a lot of growth happens, but one of the most important events that occurs in Exodus is the theophany, the realization of God's presence rather dramatically at Mount Sinai. What that Celtic theory that I actually learned at Canterbury from listening to many senior ministers of the thin place, the place where God and humanity meet in a rarefied, rather unique environment where they come together. Literally, the cloud descended as Moses ascended, the Torah tells us in Exodus. So it was a meeting. They both went halfway, if you will. The revelation of the covenant there and the commandments that are associated with it that help us fulfill the covenant. There's a lot more in Exodus after that. And I just lump that into a catalog I call foundational memory, because as important as it is to have a covenant, it's much more important to keep a covenant. And to keep a covenant, you need a guidebook. You need a constitution. You need a structure that ensures you remember and you are acculturated into observance. And so this is really part of that important gestation. Now, how to do that before 10 o'clock? Well, you can't. So I'm leaving the book a little bit where he does sort of a range over Exodus, and it's all very interesting, and I commend it to you. But I just thought, well, I've got time to focus on one thing. This is what I'm going to focus on. Perhaps one of the most important and famous passages in the entire book of Exodus from chapter 20, and that is the 10 words, the 10 statements, the Big 10 if you're in the Midwest. So we're going to focus on the 10 commandments. Why 10 statements? Well, it has to do with the translation. These words, hadvarim, means statements. It comes from the root word meaning simply a word, devar, but it can also mean a little homily, a talk. It can mean a discussion. Hadvarim. In a bigger sense, it can even mean just stuff. And aseret is 10, the second word there. So the 10 words, the 10 statements, all we know is it's plural. Where did commandments come from? Our good friends in the 17th century, the King James Version of the Bible calls it the 10 Commandments. And that is a beautiful translation of the Bible, still is to this day, and it's stuck. So everybody calls it that. The Jews call it that. Everybody calls it that. The Decalogue is another term you hear. That was a Christian early father of the church, Clement of Alexandria, around the dawn of the 3rd century, called the Decalogue. And again, that's just out of the Greek tradition. And then somebody I'm going to talk about, I mentioned a couple of times, Rabbi Gunther Plaut, late of Toronto, Canada, where he served in the Jewish synagogue with the prettiest name I've ever heard of any place in Toronto. It's called the Holy Blossom Temple. Doesn't that sound like it should be in Japan somewhere? You know, oh yeah, Holy Blossom, nice place. You know, but I mean, you can see that, you know. But I mean, Holy Blossom, it just. I mean, I see Madam Butterfly, but that's what it's called, and it's a liberal synagogue in Toronto, a quite sizable synagogue, and he was the senior rabbi and quite a scholar. And in the 1980s, he did a translation and commentary of the Torah that is still one of the most often consulted. It is a fabulous volume. And I've used it just constantly. It's where you go. If you go to Temple Emmanuel and you have the book with the Torah in it and the other portions that we read on the holy days, that's the version we have that's sitting in a rack, and you can just help yourself and you can follow along when they read the Torah portion out of the scroll and all this sort of thing. So it's just really, really nice nice book. But let's talk about these commandments, these 10 words. So we find them twice in the Torah. We find them in Exodus 20, and where we're going to focus today, and we'll see them again in the 5th chapter of Deuteronomy. They are slightly different, and when we get to Deuteronomy, we'll talk about that too. The Jewish and Christian versions slightly differ as well, especially in the numbering of what the commandments are. And this is a bit of a puzzle. The Torah does not tell us which number of the commandments. It just states them in order. And so you're sort of free to determine what the 10 are. Where does the one leave off and the second begin, and on and so forth. So basically, that's where it's mentioned, is that the Jewish view breaks the first commandment into two parts that the Christian interpretation, the Christian Bible, consider the first commandment together. And then the compensation comes at the end when the Christian scriptures break the last commandment, which is one commandment, in the Jewish reading, into two. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference in my mind, but I'm just going to talk about it from the Jewish perspective. I did find this quote, just to close this slide out, that the covenantal relationship is truly the important thing. And this is Gunther Plaut's words: the God of graciousness and authority, that's an important word, a saving God of graciousness and authority, and a people who agree to abide by it. Even in the jeweled crown of the Torah, it shines with unmatched brilliance. So let's take a look. So let's look at the first two. This is the Jewish enumeration. And I was in a meeting years ago that was a regular meeting of Jewish professionals in Birmingham. All of the synagogues in the Federation and the JCC were all represented in all this group. And we would meet at the JCC for lunch once a month and talk about issues affecting the community. And I was part of this. And I was sitting next to the Orthodox rabbi of Knesset Israel when it was still on Montevallo Road, a real nice young man named Harry Rosen, and I loved his sense of humor. He was a really nice guy. And they passed out the agenda. We got done with lunch. They passed out the agenda, and whoever was in charge of the meeting said, okay, Roman numeral 1. He says, excuse me, does it have to be Roman numerals? So I think about that every time I use Roman numerals, and so here it is. The first commandment is this sentence: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. And you might look at that and say, well, I can see why we might have trouble identifying that as a commandment, right? What does it command us to do? Nothing, but so we look further. This is more than a preamble, according to Rabbi Plaut. It is rather the statement of the oneness and the uniqueness of God, this God, the God, who is the creator of the nation of Israel, who redeemed Israel from slavery to be God's people, and that recognizes Israel's history. In other words, before we have a covenant, we have to know where we are coming from and who we are. As he put it, this God is anchored in the people's experience and validated by their free acceptance of the divine will. Now, the other thing about this commandment is the word your. Now, I know we don't say thee and thy and thine anymore. And it's considered old-fashioned and all of that. But you know, something's lost in translation between singular and plural. We effectively have no second-person singular in English anymore if we're not using thee, thy, and thine. And I don't use it either. But I learned this is, I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And of course, when I grew up, we were full of these and thys. That's the prayer book was written that way, and it's not anymore at the temple. It's, you know, we're into you and your and all that. But we lose something. We lose the fact that this God is singular. It is directed to each individual. And when he refers to Egypt, because it's a singular experience, it's more than just the geographical land of Egypt, which is the history, but it's rather the Egypt of our lives. Read wilderness, read time when we are in slavery. We wouldn't be human if we hadn't at some time or another been slaves to someone or something. And this is the God who redeems from whatever your Egypt is. If there's a commandment here, it's that it's our duty to acknowledge God. A famous midrash on this is a great thing. It expresses God and Israel's codependence in this, implying, I am the Lord if I am thy God. And that's an interesting thing to think about. God needs to be acknowledged as God, and that's the commandment here. Otherwise, God will not fulfill or cannot fulfill his plans for redemption of the world. The God that God is, the merciful God, less than the stern dispenser of justice, depends on whether or not God is acknowledged. This is why it's more than preamble, but commandment. Number 2, you shall have no other gods beside me. Well, isn't this interesting? We spend our lives trying to banish the idea of polytheism from our lives. I mean, we're evolved beyond that. We don't eat our children. We don't make sacrifices and stuff like that. We're not savages. And we are not polytheistic. We are proud of being monotheistic. And here is God acknowledging that polytheism is out there, and he isn't going to do anything about it. He's just saying, you are not polytheistic. And then he goes into specifics. You do not make a sculpted image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below, on the waters under the earth. Why? Simply put, why don't we make statues of God? What would you sculpt? Do you know what God looks like? I thought he looked like George Bernard Shaw. Because when I was a kid, my mother had the cast album of My Fair Lady. And in it, that great Broadway illustrator, Al Hirschfeld, you saw his cartoon on Playbill magazine and in the New Yorker sometimes. It showed George Bernard Shaw manipulating a marionette, and the marionette was Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews, or whatever it was, Eliza Doolittle and Henry Higgins, manipulating them from this cloud. And I saw a white beard and a bald head and a cloud, and I just assumed that was God. So that's what God looks like to me. He looks like George Bernard Shaw. And if you've read a lot of George Bernard Shaw, and I've read a lot because he was a renowned music critic and published a lot in terms of his careers as playwright and all that, he was a really, really active music critic, and his columns about music are fantastic. Nobody could level an insult like George Bernard Shaw. You know the great story about Winston Churchill and Shaw. Shaw, of course, was a great playwright in addition to everything else he did, and he and Churchill never really saw eye to eye on many things. Probably had something to do with the fact that Shaw was Irish. But at any rate, Shaw, let's see. Let me see, make I get it right. Shaw sends Churchill 2 tickets for a play that's opening of his. Sends him 2 tickets and said, come to the opening night, bring a friend, if you have one. Well, you know who he's messing with. Churchill sent back a message. Thank you. Can't attend first night. Send tickets for a second night, if there is one. All right. So we're in trouble if we even start imagining what God looks like. And God doesn't want us to think about what he looks like or she looks like, because that is in itself an idolatry. To this day, you will not find sculptures or likenesses of any human being in a synagogue. Not Moses. I mean, yeah, outside the synagogue, you might find it in a lobby somewhere, but you're not going to find it in the sanctuary itself. There are no representations of people. So great is the fear of creating an idol of a human being. So there you have it. They're pretty stained glass windows in a lot of places, but you never see those likenesses there. Now, the next part of the commandment, for I, the Lord thy God, am an impassioned God. And that is the translation that Plout uses, and I looked it up because I learned a different word that you probably learned from King James. Remember what it was? Jealous. I was a jealous God. And I always thought, ooh, jealous. Ooh, But of course, you got to have your 17th century hat on when you listen to some of this translation. But I looked up, I just thought, let's go back to the source. Well, they're both right. Impassioned, jealous. But the word, the first translation that I found was envious. Envious. And the next phrase, so I'm an envious God, but I like impassioned God. I think that to me well, I like the translation. Visiting the guilt of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, to me, this says God can be tough. God can chastise, but God is also merciful. And what this says to me is that the mercy far outweighs the chastisement. And this may touch on a thing that we talked about last class about the nature of sin. Sin tends to be for the moment and can always be repented of and forgiven. And so that's a thing about sin. The idea is that, well, I sinned, but I will do better next time. Now, I'm not talking about, there are some sins that are like sins, but that's a whole other story, I'm just talking about your everyday, officer, I stopped at that sign. All right, anyway, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation. So we have a God who is impassioned, a God who acts on feelings, who reacts. And this is rather sophisticated theology, I think, because the little gods, going back to you shall have only one God, the little gods that you worshiped, they in Greek and Roman, these were like one-track gods. They were one thing, Vulcan was a god of the fire and the forge, and that was it. And he didn't really have an opinion on how the grass grows. It wasn't his job. It wasn't his job description. Gods were little and gods were single issue gods. And this is an omnipotent God. And that's different. And the gods were not flexible and adjustable and adaptable in many of these smaller religions, which is why I guess you needed so many of them. Seems logical to me. And of course, the fact is, we do still have other gods. We have them all the time, and we chase after them. But we just need to remember who the real God is. Third commandment, you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. This speaks of two really important things in a Jewish reading. One is the sacredness of God's name. God's name was revealed to who? The first person who heard God's name. Right, Moses, at a bush that was burning but not consumed. And that'll get your attention, but only if you're paying attention. You might think it's just the Moody landfill. But if you look, but you have to look closely to see miracles. You have to see it's burning but not consumed. It's actually just fire. If it's not consumed, can we even say it's a burning bush? I'm not sure it's burning. It's fire interpolated on a bush. Now that's rather miraculous, So we have to see these miracles. Moses saw the miracle. Now, granted, maybe that would get your attention, but Moses probably needed all the help he could get at that point in his life. He was, after all, in the wilderness trying to figure it out, tending sheep. And anyway, so God's name itself. And what is that name? This happens in the book of Exodus. What's God's name? Go ahead. Well, Yahweh, but what is and we don't really even know how that's pronounced. I am what I am. I am that I am. However, in the Hebrew, there is a little trick. And it could say, I am what I will be, or I will be what I will be. So, or I even will be what I am. There's some flexibility in that. And it doesn't really tell us much, does it? But the name was not spoken, even to this day. You can get a lot of literature from Jews who are so careful about, in journals and periodicals, newspapers and whatever, that they don't write G-O-D. They write G-D, L-R-D. They even, if they use a Hebrew name, they mispronounce it deliberately. Elohim, which is a name for God, is pronounced Elohim. Adonai, which is actually a name for God that's only uttered, which really means my master, is only uttered in prayer, in the context of prayers, and they will say it in the context of prayers. They will pronounce Adonai, but when they are speaking of God outside of that, they will say Adoshem, which is Ado name. It's just a nonsense word. Okay, so point is, we go to great lengths to protect God's name, which is very holy. And what is the word that came from Yahweh, that strange conjunction of a y, a h, a v, and another almost silent h, Yahweh? No, close. Jehovah. That's where we get the name Jehovah. Jehovah is an anglicization of that unpronounceable, what's called the tetragrammaton, the four-letter word. I knew one rabbi who said, for all we know, it could have been Yoo-hoo. The other thing that this commandment refers to is the nature of oaths itself. Oaths, I don't know. Those things are very, very sacred and very, very important. Don't take an oath if you don't mean it. Especially don't take an oath using God's name unless you mean it. So when we become president of the United States, or we become a congressman, or we become a postmaster, or we even, anyway, and maybe even when we make testimony in a court of law, we usually say, so help me God. So there it is. That's what we're doing. We are taking an oath. We'd better mean it. God says, okay, you want to take an oath in my name, you'd better be aware of that. So that's to me, one of the things. And we'll hopefully have questions. Now, there's a shift after the third commandment. We lose the first person about God entirely. The first three are really about God. The next 7 are about us. God steps back. He's still giving the words. He's still making the commandments. But you don't see the first person anymore. He steps away after that. And we go to this one. How curious. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Wow. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, why is the Sabbath the most important holiday in Judaism? Besides the fact that it's presented here. But does anybody want to know why Jews consider the Sabbath to be the most important holiday, more important than the New Year, the Day of Atonement, any of the festivals? Why? Think biblically. What about the creation? That's right. It's the first holiday ordained in the history of the world. Before they set up any other days, God hallows that day, the 7th day. The other reason is it happens every week. It happens more often than any other holiday in Judaism. So the Sabbath is always set apart. And it's the one practice from prehistory to the present that is so there. The verb, the first word is interesting, to remember. Zachor is the word, the first word in this commandment. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. Remember the day of rest, the seventh day. It's the first word, and it's such a powerful word. And in a Jewish mindset, remembering is everything. In Israel, modern Israel, there is a national holiday called Yom HaZikaron, and it occurs in usually around May. It follows the Hebrew calendar. It's on the same day in the Hebrew calendar, but it usually comes around early May. And it's called Yom HaZikaron. Yom means day. HaZikaron means the day, day of remembering, the day of remembering. And it is the Memorial Day holiday. And unlike our Memorial Day, it's not, everybody knows it's about more than mattress sales. It's not a day necessarily that people are away from their business, but there is a tradition that in the larger cities, and maybe I think everywhere in the country, they have a lot of air raid sirens in Israel. They need them for all kind of reasons, but the sirens are sounded at, I think, noon on Yom HaZikaron, and everybody stops what they're doing. And there is this collective moment of silence in the whole country, and you can almost feel the stillness. Hey, speaking of feeling the stillness, you can feel it every Shabbat in Israel. How many people have been to Israel? Remember what Saturdays are like? They're like Sundays used to be in the South. Everything's shut down. And you know the stories about the elevators in the hotels? All right, so traditional Jews on the Sabbath are not supposed to light fires. You don't light a fire. And so when electricity came into being, the rabbis had to deal with what's the implication between electricity and electric appliances. And so they decided, well, you shouldn't activate any electrical appliances, including igniting a spark plug, which is why they don't drive on the Sabbath. And you're lighting a fire that way too, the internal combustion engine and all that. So anyhow, what the nice hotels did, the ones we all stay in when we go, they're very tall, of course, and they have one elevator that is programmed from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday to go express to the top floor. You get in at the lobby, you go all the way to the top floor, and it opens at automatically every level on the way back down. So it takes a little longer, but it's Shabbat. What are you going to do? What you got to do anyway? It's the Sabbath. And so you just wait. And when you get off on the fourth floor, you haven't had to push a button. Just wait for that elevator. It will come. It takes a little longer. And that's sort of the way one acts on the Sabbath. Everything takes a little longer, but, just stay cool and relax, So, but anyway, what's called the Shabbat lift over there is really a kind of a unique testament to the pervasiveness of the Sabbath there. There is a quote from an early 20th century Zionist writer who went by the pen name of Achad Ha'am, which meant the representative of the people. That was his pen name. And he said, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And that's one other final point that I would make with respect to the importance of the Sabbath. Having a holiday once a week, the Romans laughed at the Jews for taking a day off. That was just one lost work day, But we're still here and they're not. So, you go figure. And the Christians picked right up on that, So we all keep a Sabbath. And I think there is importance in that. And that you hear from pulpits in churches now more than ever, the importance of recovering a Sabbath. Now, the last five commandments, oh no, all right. There's a shift in tone here. Now we're not talking about God's relationship with his people so much, but the equally essential component of how we are in relationship with one another. That's really what unites these back five. And the implication is that these are all as holy as and important as one's relationship with God. In fact, you might say it's vital. If we can't get along with each other, we are not going to be in relationship with God, not the right relationship. CF. Jealous God above. All right. Now, you shall not, you honor your father and your mother. Now, just in the interest of gender equality, in Leviticus 19, which we're getting to next week, this is sort of repeated, and it says your mother and your father. So just want you to know they thought about that. Yeah, so there's this. Honor your father and mother. And I know people, I have a story, I'm not a clergy person, and but I've heard about people who have gone to talk to a rabbi about their impossible mothers who are now requiring assisted living, and they maybe were difficult, and they're becoming more difficult. And people question, at least the case I'm thinking of, I'm just having a hard time loving my mother and father like I'm commanded to do. And the rabbi said, wait a minute, you're not commanded to love them. You're commanded to honor them. Now ask yourself, are you doing the right thing? Well, I'm trying, I'm doing, she gets very good care, and I stop by all the time, and I think, he said, all right. So honor your parents. That doesn't mean you have to love them. And in some ways, those who honor a parent without loving them are actually maybe a little bit closer to the mark. Just think about it. Anyway, pretty sage advice, which is another reason I'm not a rabbi, because I would not have thought of that. But there it is. The Torah requires us to be respectful of our parents, but even God cannot command that you